Data binding. So this is quite interesting as they've introduced all kinds of new and interesting syntax into our templates. And I think I have a picture here. Yes. So we still have our classic double curly braces string interpolation, but now we have really two main bindings. You have property bindings and event bindings. So now you can bind to properties from your component within your template, and it's a square bracket. If you want to listen for an event on your template and then convey that back to your component, it's parentheses. Or if you want to do them both, so there was kind of this concession of like, well, how in the world do we work with forms? Like, we need two-way data binding. Like, it only makes sense that when I type in the text field that I automatically get this information. I mean, that was like the real money demo when Angular 1 first came out. It's like, look, I can type in this text field and it automatically updates over here. Like, how are we going to have that demo still? So they said, well, let's take this one-way binding and this one-way binding, and we're going to put them together, and now we have two-way data binding. So I guess two one-way streets put together is a two-way street. And so we have this hot dog in a box kind of syntax here of the box, the hot dog, and it's simply saying when this property changes, then it will fire off an event and it'll show up in your controller, and vice versa. And so you can see here, I don't know where my mouse is, but you can see here this ng model message. That's what that looks like. So pretty simple. Yes, we have a question in the back.
The first value, is that just a one-time expression?
What's that?
Is that just an expression? Because you have a property binding from component to template, but the top level where it's value, is that just any expression that will evaluate once when it's rendered and that's it? There's no tie between the component and template?
So I believe this actually will change in the component, and it's still, so this is almost the equivalent of property. And there's some reasons why you would use string interpolation over like property binding. But when it updates in the component, it will update as well. So it's still, I mean, so string interpolation is always been one way, but it's not a one-time deal. So it's not a bind once, rather. And so we're back on familiar ground. A service is just a class that we make available to our injector with the injectable metadata. I think we are almost in the home stretch. My voice is getting tired. So a component is just a directive with added template features. But we also have built-in directives that come with Angular 2. ng4, ngIf, ng-switch, a few off the top of my head. But again, there's just a handful because now that we're using native DOM events and property binding, it's much simpler. So in this case, we have a directive, and we're just saying, hey, take this thing and apply it to the FEM blinker selector. Dependency injection, yes.
Is it safe to assume that a directive is basically a behavior modification of a component?
Yes.
Okay.
So in Angular 1, there was really kind of two styles of components, or directives rather, that is pretty obvious now in Angular 2, is you had a component directive that was kind of this self-encapsulated like thing that you would pass around. And so UI Bootstrap is a really good example of that, of like, oh, I need this, date picker. And so you would basically go and say like, date or UI.date.picker or whatever, and it had all of that behavior encapsulated within that directive. And so up until Angular 2 I always referred to those kind of directives just simply as components. It was self-encapsulated. And then you had what I would refer to as decorator directives, that I have this thing that already exists, I need to augment its behavior. And so then I would go in and do essentially I would decorate it with a directive. So that concept still applies, and it's pretty easy in Angular 2 is that you have a component which is the self-contained encapsulated unit of functionality, whereas a directive essentially augments any component's behavior with new capabilities. So for instance, a drag and drop would be a good example of that. A blink, if you wanted to blink a component. If I had a directive that I wanted to turn the mic over to Scott, I think he has commentary.
Yeah, just to add to that, so the analogy for the 1-to-1 ratio of like, how is it now in Anchor 2 versus Anchor 1? In Anchor 1, when you made a directive and used the restrict property, you had the E, which was for element directive. Think of that as the component in Angular 2. And then you might have placed an A for an attribute directive. That's a directive here in Angular 2. So those are the differences. E is the component, A is the directive. That's really it.
Ooh. If you had a mic, you could just drop it right now and walk out the room. Yeah, that's... and he breaks his toe. So dependency injection, it works fairly similar to Angular 1, I think, in theory. So on the surface is, I need this thing delivered to my component. You put it in the constructor of your class, and it's available. The difference is that Angular 2 works on the concept of hierarchical dependency injection or hierarchical injectors, so that each component gets its own injector. And so you can actually declare services at a component level. Whereas in Angular 1, if you injected a service, it was essentially an application singleton. That's all you were getting. In Angular 2, that's not the case. So now, whereas Angular 1 had a single kind of high-level injector, now we're allowing injectors at a component level. The reason being, I believe, is that as Angular starts to kind of gear itself to be a large application platform, that there are use cases where you would want to, on a sub-feature basis, really dial in specific behavior. And so with the kind of component system architecture that exists in Angular 2, you can inject it to a certain component, and it's only available to that component and its children. And so that's pretty neat that you can actually create even kind of some variations of that on kind of a per component tree basis. Now, if you need a service to be available for your entire application, then you do it at the top level when you bootstrap your app, and then it's going to be available top down. So, for instance, when I bootstrap, I will generally put in my router providers because I want routing, obviously, to be available for every single thing. Another thing is, if you have, for instance, a large application, you really can be very specific about what gets what instead of making it available to kind of like everything. So there's some performance issues there as well. But in this case, you can see in the experiments component, I am basically injecting the state service and the experiment service into it. And I've also marked it as private. This is a TypeScript thing that if you violate this, you'll get a compile time error, but at runtime, it just gets stripped out. And so we'll talk a little bit more about TypeScript in the next module, but this is pretty much kind of how it works, is that I want to inject, or I want to make experiment service injectable. So you just write your class, injectable metadata, and then it's now available to the injector, and then from any other component or service or directive, you can then inject that into its constructor. The one thing that I like is, if we've been through a few of these slides, is you'll start to notice that, again, directives, components, even pipes, which are essentially Angular 1 filters, services, that they're really just classes. And so now you kind of have this unified kind of syntax across everything.